Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Florida Race Equity Challenge. Today's webinar is How Implicit Bias Rules. My name is Ash Baca, and I'll be your moderator for today. I'd like to explain some of the technical aspects of using the GoToWebinar platform to everyone. All of our audience members will be muted for today's webinar. If you take a look at the top right corner of your screen, you'll see a control panel with a red arrow button at the top. If you click that arrow, the full control panel will pop out and you'll see a chat box where you can submit any questions for today's speakers or technical issues to our staff. At the end of the presentation, we will facilitate as many questions as we can in the time allotted for us today. With that being said, it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. The presenters currently work with the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice. Mr. Omar Bowler serves as an Assistant Chief of Probation for Circuit 18. He has been called upon several occasions to present on implicit bias. He is also a retired Marine who has served our country honorably. Dr. Ira Thomas is the Justice Reform Coordinator for the South Region. He has spent his professional life serving youth, their families, and trying to improve their life chances. Let's please welcome Mr. Bowler and Dr. Thomas.
Thank you, Mr. Ash.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ira Thomas, and on behalf of my co-presenter, Mr. Omar Bowler, we want to welcome everyone to our presentation on how implicit bias rules. Our presentation is the last webinar for Block 1 of the Florida Race Equity Challenge. Block 1 is focused on all collaborative team members assessing their personal perspectives around race equity. Mr. Adam Foose kicked off Block 1 of the challenge when he challenged and demanded each of us to use our sword and shield of privilege to forge a more just society. He recounted the privilege he received and how it kept him out of the criminal justice rabbit hole for drug trafficking. He implored us to use our collective sword and shield to change the very institutions and systems that all too many youth, and particularly youth of color, become entangled with. In addition to Adam's call to action, there's also a national call to rid our country and world of historical systemic racism and structural racialization, which is simultaneously forcing the citizenry to assess long-held personal perspectives of race, and in particular, racial bias. This statewide challenge wants all participants to assess our personal perspectives on race by engaging in an authentic race conversation that may create the discomfort that Adam encouraged us to sit with. Today's presentation, however, on how implicit bias rules comes at an unbelievable historic moment as we witness unprecedented multiracial and multi-generational civil protests to end and dismantle systemic and structural racism that is clearly preventing our nation from actualizing its ideals and becoming a nation rooted in race equity. Not only are we witnessing internal unrest, but this is happening while the nation is also in the heart of a global health pandemic that has taken the lives of more than 120,000 Americans, which has disproportionately affected communities of color. Many individuals, ranging from heads of organizations to researchers, when asked about what may be responsible for the horrific racial disparities present in our society, the overwhelming response has been implicit bias. Even Secretary Marstiller, in her opening remarks, reminded us to make sure our decision points are not the result of biased decision-making. Adam also alluded to the concept of implicit bias as a likely role as to why, for example, 42% of those in prisons and jails in the US are Black males. who only make up 7% of the US population. What explains the deafening disparate outcomes for African Americans and other people of color in healthcare, education, housing, employment, and the most consequential, the criminal justice system? This presentation aims to provide you critical information about implicit bias, and with the hope that you will commit to deepening your awareness of and techniques to manage our implicit bias. We encourage everyone who hasn't had the opportunity to engage in a full day training on implicit bias to do so. We also recognize that just completing a training is only part of the work that we must engage in to create a more equitable society. The information that we're going to share with you today has been gleaned from the voluminous research literature on implicit bias. And just before I go to our next presentation objectives, could you please grab a pen or pencil and a blank sheet of paper that I'm going to ask you to use in just a short while. But let me now explain our objectives for the conference. One, we want you to understand what implicit bias means and how it may influence our decisions. And second, we want you also to understand that being implicitly biased does not necessarily mean we act in an explicitly biased ways. And third, we also want to learn to recognize some behaviors that may suggest bias or differential treatment. And lastly, we're going to share some techniques that will help us de-bias our perceptions and improve our interactions with others. At this moment, I'd like to turn it over to Omar, who's going to take you through a short video. Omar?
Thank you, Ira. I appreciate it. Before we actually get into a video, I kind of want to share a story with you. It's about a boy in a foreign country. He was 18 years old, and he was in this foreign country actually for his job. This was his first duty station as a United States Marine. He was stationed with an engineer company. And he was pretty excited because he was newly promoted to corporal. He was assigned the position as a squad leader, even though he's in an engineer company. And a squad, he's directly responsible for about anywhere from 8 to 10 folks. Within a platoon, there could be about as much as 4 squads. So that's in a platoon, that's 40, 45 people. And he, like I said, he was excited to be there because this was a foreign country and he had never even been out the country and probably, other than boot camp, been out the state. So he was actually assigned to this company. And one day he was actually returning from lunch, as he always does, excited about the new challenge, being in a foreign country. And he's walking to his engineer office. And he can hear something out the side of his ear that's letting him know that somebody's talking. It's his staff sergeant, and in rank, that would be his boss's boss. So he's actually walking, and he can hear the staff sergeant passionate, probably even angry, and he's having a shotgun of the N-word. And he's saying, if you listen to this N-word, you will rule the day. I don't want anybody in this office to be listening to that N-word. Now I'm paraphrasing. This was a long time ago. So the staff sergeant continued to talk racial slurs, and this is happening just like this. So he walks into that office and he makes eye contact with his squad, the other 3 squads, the staff sergeant, and the sergeant of the platoon. The interesting thing about leadership in the military, chain of command, that is your structure. That is what you deal with in the realm of communication. When something goes down, that information is given just to that squad leader. And if something goes down, weapon assignments is based on that squad. So it's very important for continuity of leadership that people respect that chain of command. So I was overwhelmed. I'm standing there and this person is talking about me. I couldn't control myself. My chest bowed out. I'm looking at some of those folks that was in previous units with me, at least in training with me. And the staff sergeant cleared his throat and continued to talk racial slurs. So I did an about face. I walked out of there, and right next to the engineer compound, across the parade deck, was the administration building. The parade deck is so large that they, obviously have parades on it. They've been known to land helos on it. So I'm walking across that, and this overwhelming rush of emotion. I am walking like I'm in a parade. My chest is out, my head is up, and I had this uncontrollable stream of tears coming down my face. I didn't know what I was going to do. I'm thinking to myself, I got 3.5 years. Why didn't I listen to my granddad? So I'm thinking about this, and the one thing I want you to get from this story, lawyer Isaac Wright said, if you don't see yourself in someone else's pain, you won't do anything about it. The clip we're going to watch, I named it What I See. So we're going to watch the clip, and then we're going to talk about it on the other side. So as I was watching the video, I couldn't help think about some of the things that the images, if you would, that was going on in that film. I wonder, what did the gentleman have to say to his son when he noticed the mother rolling up the window? I wonder what the young girl thought in the car when mom rolled up the window, what apparently seemed to be her friend. I wonder what he thought about when he was teaching his son how to float or swim. I wonder what he thought about when obviously somebody did not want to sit next to him in a restaurant, or when he walked to the elevator and no one stopped it. This presentation is meant to open your eyes to something that we talked about, we skirt around, but we don't address. So hopefully with the information that you get from this presentation, it'll spark a conversation. That is my hope. That's actually my prayer, that you actually go to your different offices based on our professional lives, and we actually talk about this. So when we look, where does it begin? Researchers say there's about 4 things that happen within an organization that causes racial imbalance. And every organization has this in common. The first thing is implicit bias. We'll talk a little bit about it, but simply that's just something I know, so I say and I do. The next one is racism. Racism is a little bit more sinister in that it's about treating someone different just because how they look or what group they belong to. And then you have institutional racism, which this system advantages some and at the chronic disadvantage of others. Examples of institutional racism is slavery. Other examples may be stop and frisk policies. Other examples is crack versus cocaine in the 80s. The next thing is what this presentation is actually about. It's about implicit bias. So what does that mean? What it means is we need to first understand bias, implicit bias. So we need to understand bias, and we need to understand implicit bias. The second thing is we need to know where we lie in our information and how much we know about our own bias. So with that, we have a poll question. So the question is, how would you rate your knowledge of bias? Now, the question is not knowledgeable, somewhat knowledgeable, or very knowledgeable. So you'll get a couple of seconds and we'll tally up the results. So there's some of us that say we're very knowledgeable, and then there's somewhat knowledgeable, and there's nobody that said they're not knowledgeable at all. That's a great thing. I will tell you, even if you're very knowledgeable, you're going to gain something out of this presentation, because there's things that even us in the years that we've been immersed in this subject that we found out, connections that we drew. If you're somewhat knowledgeable, you're going to get a lot of information. It's going to challenge you. And there's an opportunity here. You have two different paths to go. You can either be open to this information and be excited about what it's going to hold for you, or you can just turn it off, turn the channel. Because sometimes they do that. For you that are here, you have turned on the channel. So for that, I commend you. So what I'm going to do is turn it back over to Ira, and he's going to explain to us implicit bias.
Thank you, Omar. And the definition that we're using for implicit bias, we've taken from the North Carolina Commission on Racial and Ethnic Disparities, NC Creed. And implicit bias is an unconscious, positive or negative mental attitude towards a person, object, or group. And more research is showing that we all are influenced by these unconscious biases that can dictate our behavior without approval or awareness. But let me just expand this definition just a bit further. The key point to remember is that implicit bias is a mental process that automatically takes place in the brain. And as we try to understand all of the information around us, these associations get activated. Now, according to Patricia Devine, who is a psychologist, she says implicit bias is acquired early in life through repeated exposure to stereotypic information, which is activated automatically and without intention. And once activated, these biases are theorized also to affect our behavior in all sorts of situations. I also want to highlight another element of the definition, and that is social groups. Much of the information that gets tapped into our implicit bias comes from the social groups and the stereotypic information, which gets activated automatically. And it's also, as Patricia said, It's these associations that we have learned early in life, and they're repeated throughout life in the exposure that we receive from the groups that we're around. So I want you to do me a favor. I want you to grab that pen or pencil and that blank sheet of paper at this point, and I want to do a cultural group exercise with you. And because it will help explain further our implicit bias and how it happens. For when we talk about cultural groups, what do we mean by cultural groups? By cultural groups, groups of people who we consciously or unconsciously share identifiable values and norms, symbols, and some ways of living that are repeated and transmitted from one generation to another. Now, hold on just a second. That's very powerful, because what that means is that the information that we are constantly receiving are from those cultural groups that we either consciously or unconsciously are associated with. So let's move on to the exercise itself. On the screen, on that blank sheet of paper you have, I want you to draw these 5 circles. In these 5 circles, I want you to put in there the cultural groups that you're associated with. It could be your church group, it could be religion, it could be your racial identity, it could be your gender, sexual orientation, it could be military, as Omar talked about, okay? And I want you to take about 45 seconds, and Omar is going to be my timer to give you the complete 45 seconds. I want you to put those cultural groups that you're associated with. Omar, start the timer.
All right, Ira, we got a couple of more seconds left. And as a steward of time.
Great, thank you, Omar. So you should have filled in those circles with the cultural groups. I'll give you a personal example of mine. One of the groups I would put in there is AME. Now, for those folks who may not know what AME is, or those folks who do know, AME stands for African Methodist Episcopal Church. I'm an AME member within the AME Church. The AME Church it's based upon social and racial justice. It welcomes everyone. So you may have put in one of your circles religion. But the point of this exercise is that it is from these cultural groups and others that we may not have identified with, and we may not do it, we may not recognize it to everyone, but it's the information that we receive from these groups that give us identity, that also give us a lot of information into our minds, into our brains about other people, other events, other objects. It could be about, again, a religious group. It could be about teachers. It could be about professors, you name it. The point is that this represents our in-groups. These are our affinity groups. These are people who we gel with, that we vibe with, that we identify with, okay? Now, I want you to do a second exercise for me. I want you to write the names of 2 people on the same sheet, of 2 people, of 2 friends who are not part of your DNA, in other words, are not in your family, I want you to write 2 people who are closest to you. I'm going to give you 10 seconds to do that. 2 people.
And time, Ira.
Thank you, Omar. Now, here's what I want you to do. If you think about these individuals separately, I want you to compare them to the characteristics of the cultural groups you have categorized yourself in. And I want you to ask yourself, how many of the same characteristics are shared by these individuals? Do it for the first person. And of course, we can't see it. I would love to see it. If we were in person, we could see it. But I want you to look at person number 2. Again, how many characteristics within your cultural circles are shared by that second individual? The point is this. We normally surround ourselves with people who think like us, who may look like us, who have had shared experiences, okay? And the point is that in order to also tap into our implicit bias, we need to go from the familiar to the unfamiliar. Because too often we're tied into information that we believe confirms who we are, okay? And we also want people around us who are like us. It's a natural thing. But at times, implicit bias can also have a negative component to it because we're only surrounding ourselves with select group of people. Okay, let's move on. The other thing I'd like to bring to your attention, just as we look at the cultural groups that we are a part of, we receive a lot of information. And remember, the definition said we receive a lot of that information early in life and throughout our life experiences. And if we continuously have the same kinds of information, rarely do we challenge that information. And what we do with that information a lot is create what is called schemas. Schemas are nothing more than mental shortcuts that the brain uses to organize and categorize information. And it's automatic. Schemas allow us to create relationships because of all that information, okay? And an example, just a very simple example, is a 4-sided figure. Immediately, if someone says, what is a 4-sided figure? You are going to say square, because that's the schema. And let me press this a little bit further. Many people have had the opportunity to interact with professors. All of us have schemas for a professor. And most students look at their professors with this particular schema. As it says on the screen, professors know their subjects, they're prepared for class, they attend class, they have office hours, they also give and grade assignments and exams. When I was going through my undergraduate, graduate, and doctoral program, I used the same schema because I was a student. Even if that professor did not show up for that class, I wouldn't necessarily attach a negative connotation. I would assume that the professor had an emergency. But if professors act outside of the schema that most students operate on, students will begin to create their own personal schemas of professors. Okay, so it's very important that if professors perform outside of the natural schema, then students are going to create their own. I did that when I was a graduate student in social work. I went to the University of Maryland Graduate School of Social Work. And one of the things that came to my attention right away is that most of my professors, when presenting us with information, was only presenting information from one source, and that source was white scholars. Through much of my social work program, I did not receive information about what other scholars thought about social welfare, thought about certain family dynamics. Even in the school where two professors of color, Dr. Harriet McAdoo and Dr. John McAdoo, who studied father involvement. But much of the information that I received was that fathers, and particularly black fathers, were non-existent. That wasn't my schema. And in order to really confirm my schema, I began researching what other researchers of color were thinking and writing about. So schemas are very important. Schemas help us organize, and also schemas can have a downside because it's not the reality of everyone. Moving right along. Omar, I'm going to have you take on this poll question for everyone.
Thank you, Ira. So our next poll question. If I told you to go to Jacksonville, what county would you end up in? So you got a couple of selections here: Morgan County, Duval County, Onslow County, Pulaski County, all of the above. So 85% picked Duval, and you're partially right. The 14% that picked all of the above is correct. And I probably would have picked all of the above too, because I know of Onslow County. I was stationed as a Marine in Onslow County, North Carolina, in Jacksonville. So it's about where our schemas put us. So if we have a frame of reference that says Arkansas, then we're going to pick the Jacksonville in that county. So if we have a frame of reference in North Carolina, like I said, we're going to pick Onslow County. And then again in Florida, Duval County. So our brain makes shortcuts based on the information we have. So the interesting thing to me is, I remember when I was a kid, I would get in trouble if I would just tell my mom part of the story. And she said, that's lying by omission. So you may be lying to yourself because you don't have enough information. Go ahead, Ira.
And to follow up on that, let's now make a distinction between explicit bias versus implicit bias. When we think about explicit bias attitudes, as you see on the screen, they're conscious, they are deliberative, they're value-based, meaning it could be social or personal, and it's easy to self-report. And I'll give you an example. An example could be, I don't like strawberry ice cream. I do like strawberry ice cream. I'm just giving an example, but that is explicit. I don't like strawberry ice cream. Okay. On the other side is implicit bias. And again, implicit bias attitudes are unconscious, they're spontaneous, they're based upon habits from direct and vicarious experiences, and they're subject to response latency. All that means is that much of the information that you've been receiving over the life cycle, you may not respond to it until later. It may throw you totally off guard. But there's one more thing I want to lay on this that I think is really necessary. Much of the information that we receive from the cultural groups that we're part of and the schemas that we use to organize and categorize information, we must submit and agree that we live in a society that is race-centered. So much of the information that we are trying to organize and navigate have been corrupted in many ways by this thing we call race. This is why that's why it's so important that we really focus on race equity and find a way to make sure that our society is a race equitable society. Omar is now about to take you through some information to help you understand the different types of bias. Omar?
Thanks again, Ira. So we receive information again, and that information is coming at us rapidly. We, on an unconscious level, we receive probably 11 million pieces of information per second. Our conscious brain can only process anywhere from 40 to 50 of those pieces of information per second. So the rest of that, what is it doing? It's laying dormant in our mind, wreaking havoc, because we haven't addressed our bias. And there's ways to address it. I will tell you, I was surprised when I took the Harvard implicit bias test of my biases. I thought I was well-rounded. I traveled all over the world. I was, in the military. I, lived in several different states. I associated myself with different folks. So I found myself really having to self-evaluate where my information was coming. The interesting thing is the absence of information is the absence of truth, and somebody else's information may not be the truth. So the first type of bias is like me bias. That is when you associate yourselves with somebody like you, just as Ira broke it down in the chart. We're familiar with that. We're okay with that. We like that. We're comfortable with that. Similar backgrounds, people who look like you, people who share the same ideas as you, probably even live in the same neighborhood as you. So that's like me bias. The next one is, that one's called confirmation bias. That is when we only listen to things that confirms our preconceived notions. It's almost like I said earlier, to turn off the TV when things get uncomfortable. Not to listen to someone when things get uncomfortable. As an example is, have you ever been on your computer and you were searching, even searching for some new shoes? And then you go on Facebook, you go on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. I don't care where you go, it's on your feed, whatever you looked at. Whatever it is, if you looked at police shootings against blacks, or if you looked at police shootings against whites, if you looked at whatever you looked at, it's all those like items, and only those like items is going to show up on your feed. What does that do to you? It has a negative effect on you, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Oftentimes I'll see stuff on my feed that's years old, and I'm like, this happened years ago. So the first thing I do is when I look at my feed and somebody shares a video, I'm looking at the date of the video, because I don't want to be polluted by the same thing I saw before. So again, I don't care if you're saying, Siri, help me out with this, or Alexa, help me out with this. It's only going to go based on what you've done it before. I don't care if you using Uber Eats, like most of us are probably doing now, but it's only going to pull up the food items that you like, that you searched before. The last one is anchoring bias. So anchoring bias is when our mind naturally anchors to the first piece of information that was given to us about a subject. The example here is, in most families, you're anchored to the patriarch's, I would say, political affiliation. So if your family is Democrat, more than likely, when you leave the family, when you go strike out on your own, you're going to be a Democrat. Same thing if you're a Republican. When you strike out on your own, your ideals will be Republican. It will take a whole lot for you to change that. And sometimes people do, but a lot of times people stay in that ideology because they were anchored to it. Another example is, I used to be a substance abuse counselor when I was in the Marine Corps. And I had a group going on. We had several people in the group, diverse population. And one young man was sharing his experience and why he was there. He was talking about he was sharing that he got a DUI or DWI, driving while intoxicated. And he shared his BAC. For you lawyers and judges and law enforcement personnel, counselors, you're going to get this. his BAC was 0.43. Law enforcement, when they pulled him over, they thought he should have been passed out. For him, that was a bad badge of honor that they thought he should have been passed out. He was telling the story to everybody in the group, and he went on to say that when he was a kid, when he would go to the drugstore to buy alcohol for his mom would often send him to the store to buy alcohol. Back then, you can go to the convenience store and buy alcohol without being carded. So he went there, and his mom would send him to buy 2 cases. She said, one is for you and one is for me, so long as you make the trip. So obviously he would make the trip, bring the alcohol back, and he would blow through his case. And he was telling the group about that experience. And everybody, even the older people, the eyes just lit up. How compelling he was, how normal he thought that behavior was, just took them by surprise. So they started to weigh in to let him know how abnormal it was. So he looked at me for confirmation to let me know that, hey, why don't you jump in and help me, because it's not normal. I mean, it is normal to him anyway. So I looked at him and I said, who am I? And the whole group was kind of stunned at that response. And I said it again. I said, who am I to tell you that behavior is wrong? You know, to drink as much as you drink, to have a 0.43 BAC, to drink every day, to drink a case, or for your mom to send you to get a case. She is the person that loved you, raised you, and taught you everything you know. And you want me to tell you that she's wrong? I'm not going to do it. And his eyes got big. For me, it was a interesting moment too, because I realized that in his mind, that was okay. Your reputation may be damaged by your own bias, and you may not even know it. It may be wreaking havoc in your mind because you have no idea what it was. Like I said, I was completely shocked at my bias. So we have a poll question. So the question says, only ill-intended people exhibit biased behavior. Only ill-intended people exhibit biased behavior. It's a true or false. Thank you for your participation in these poll questions too. So 99% of us said false, which you're right. And one person, I think you probably just clicked the wrong answer. But I will share with you that you're absolutely right. You don't have to be ill-intended to exhibit bias, because it's based on your history. You have no control over it. Adam Foss talked about adverse childhood experience, the ACEs, if you would. So they have found out, the CDC has found out, that people who had adverse and a certain amount of adverse experiences can experience medical conditions later in life. So oftentimes we think families and kids are bad, or they're aggressive, and they're just putting up that defense mechanism because they need to protect themselves from what is going on that we don't see. So the interesting thing about bias is we have no control over it because we all have it. Like I said, it's historical. It's embedded in our history, and it goes well beyond 1619. So that's our life. That's our bias life. So as we move on, I was finally got an opportunity to leave Okinawa, Japan, and I went to a sister company in Onslow County, Jacksonville, North Carolina. And I was, again, with an engineer unit there, and I was really excited because I was on the coast. It was North Carolina. Just if you've ever been to North Carolina, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's just really a beautiful place. So I'm working in this engineer company, and I'm having conflict with this one guy, and I have no idea. And I'm racking my brain. I've even talked to other people. I don't know why this guy doesn't like me. Obviously, he hates me. And we were working on a project. Matter of fact, we were building an engine. and I needed his expertise, so I asked him over. So I asked him to come over and help me out, and he started to curse me out because I pulled him from his project just with a question. So this struck me. I'll be honest, I probably was a little attitudinal, after that. But nonetheless, I guess my response caused a response from him, and he tried to sweep me off my feet, tried to grab my legs. If I wasn't quick enough to foil his attempts to flip me over, that would have been a bad scene. Now, there was several people watching his response to me. And our staff sergeant pulled us to the side. Like I said, I'm a non-commissioned officer. I'm a NCO. That you just can't do that. So that was a Thursday. So Thursday night, we go to the barracks. We lived in the barracks just like college dorms. We lived on the 3rd floor, and we were having what is known as field day. Some of you military folks probably know exactly what I'm talking about. And I was the corporal, so I was in charge of handing out assignments. So I'm handing out assignments because field day, the very next day, Friday morning, either the company commander, the staff sergeant, or whatever, would go through the room with a white glove. So you're literally on your hands and knees. You take everything out of your room and you clean that room, you wax it, whatever the case may be, and you bring everything back in. It's an episode. It's all night. And when you get up in the morning, you get up earlier so you can tighten it up as people are walking through those common areas. So just to give you a picture of what's going on. So we're assigning assignments, and I'm assigning assignments, and he yells real loud, "Y'all really gonna listen to that N-word?" And I don't know what came over me. Even I know today, but I was angry. That word again had power over me, complete and total control over me. And I lunged for him and was weaving in between everybody that was in that group. And he saw, I guess, the anger in my eyes, and he sprinted for the door. So I'm chasing him, and I can see he's going for his room. And just before he closed the door, I stick my foot in there, and I slide into the door, and I close the door behind me just before anybody else gets to the door. If you can't see yourself through someone else's pain, you're not going to do anything about it. This clip we're going to watch is called "This Is About." So we're going to go ahead and watch this clip, and then we'll talk about it on the other side.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
It's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you.
You got your ID? Yeah. Okay, so stop it.
Yeah. Now, when you get pulled over...
I'm a good driver. Okay?
Baby,
don't worry.
This is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
You are not pretty for a black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
So if I can embellish about the video, there are certain conversations that certain people have to have with their kids. There are certain systems that people are treated differently in. And that's, the truth of the matter is, that's all systems. I don't care if it's the criminal justice system. Research has shown that Black people are treated differently, adversely in the criminal justice system. The housing market, there's 4,000 4 million, anywhere from 3 million to 4 million housing discrimination claims every year. The medical field, Black females die at an alarming rate during childbirth, far beyond any other statistic, any other demographic. So these systems treat us differently, and basically it's about us looking at the structures that are within them. We owe it to ourselves to look at it, because it doesn't just affect one, it affects us all. So how do we deal with our bias? There's actual ways that we can actually deal with our bias to make sure that we're operating at a level that's inclusive. Like I said, every system has these things that permeate throughout the system that allow us to treat people differently. Not that we want to. The interesting thing is I have served with many people. And I'm talking about in the military, I'm talking about law enforcement, I'm talking about with mental health professionals, substance abuse professionals, judges, lawyers, you name it. And I have found most of the folks in these systems are honorable. And one thing they hate is somebody to be within their system, especially law enforcement, for somebody to be in their system and they represent that uniform in a negative way. If there's something that crawls up their spine even worse, it is that ideology right there, that somebody would be in their ranks to the left or to the right of them, and they would not serve the purpose of that uniform. I've taken the oath 4 times in the military and 3 times with the Department of Juvenile Justice, and it's similar in nature all the way around. And I'm not saying that the system does not require reform. I think everybody can agree with that. But what I am saying is that we both quantitatively and qualitatively represent law enforcement differently. And we have perpetuated the system where we think that every person that comes out of their house and they happen to be Black, that they're violent, that they're dangerous. And that is simply not the case. It's historical in nature, but it's simply not the case. So how do we deal with our bias? Number one is we have to become aware. That's probably the biggest challenge that we have. And there's ways that we can do this. There's the implicit bias test, the Harvard Implicit Association test. This test gauges your implicit attitudes. It's been found to be reliable in several tests, but it gauges your attitudes and things that you are unaware of and unwilling to report. Like I said, this can damage your reputation because you're thinking something and everybody else knows the contrary. It is opening yourself to other possibilities. Like I said, we are in this age of technology where we can Google something and we can see it across platforms. But that doesn't serve us in our ability to do our own research, because most of us kind of fall default in what we hear, what we see on the news. And oftentimes that information, I don't care where you go and I don't care what news show that you're watching, I've watched them all, and I'm thinking to myself, that's not entirely true, even when I'm looking at ones that support my views. So it doesn't matter. You have to do your own research to make sure that the information that you're gathering is truly accurate. And you have to expose yourself with different people. Just like Ira said, in that box, we put ourselves in these boxes. We got to step outside of that. I had an interesting year in 2018. I told myself that I wanted to volunteer. And I said, I'm going to do at least two volunteer events every month. That was a daunting task with my schedule already. And I did it. And I asked my twin brother, can I take my nephew? Because he was high school age at the time and he was needing those hours anyway. So I took him to 24 events. I think we actually did 25. And most of them was with a cultural group. It was the Florida Council on Crime and Delinquency. So they just have all these events that you can be involved in. And I actually painted a house for a senior citizen. We worked at Habitat for Humanity. We did serve the homeless shelter. We did serving for the women's shelter. I mean, we were just all over the place. They just called me and I just went because I wanted to see what that was about. And what I learned was, I learned an interesting thing. I learned that I am only one step from being homeless. It's only by the grace of God that I'm not homeless. I've learned that these people are no different than me, that they share the same concerns about their welfare, about their kids. I learned the person behind the badge when I worked with law enforcement. So it was an interesting thing. So we have to put ourselves in uncomfortable places. Did I want to do some of those things? Initially, no. But once I got through with them, it was a huge benefit to me spiritually and mentally. So we got to do different things. We also got to find out what our triggers are. What are those situations that we find ourselves being biased about? And then once we find out, based on the fact that we've actually had an implicit awareness test, that we freeze and we analyze that situation so we can reduce our bias. research has shown in about 3 populations, judges, teachers, and probation officers. When these professionals have taken an implicit bias test, I don't know which one they took, and they received training on implicit bias, they reduced the outcomes, their bias, their level of bias. So it's effective. And again, that's the foundation for making structural changes. So next, we want to seek feedback. We want to have, as leaders, we want to have a system where people are open, a system of inclusiveness where people are open to give us feedback on situations that may appear biased in nature. So that is the hallmark of a leader, to be able to have that door swinging both ways. So we can get that information, so we can make sure that we don't damage the reputation of our agencies, don't damage our reputations, and certainly don't hurt the kids that we're entrusted to care about and to provide services for. We have to have an implicit approach. What that approach says is that we ask a righteous question: how do we get our conscious behaviors in line with our publicly stated remarks? Meaning, like I said, you can actually be a probation officer sworn to do no harm, and yet you are overwhelmingly violating kids of color and not kids that are white. You can be a mental health professional and overwhelmingly be sending Black kids to residential treatment and white kids to outpatient treatment, which messes them both up. Meaning, because you're overdosing, you may be overdosing the Black kids, giving them too much services, and you may be underserving the white population, the white kids. The next thing, we have to acknowledge the state of the system, meaning knowing what our biases are, that being the foundation. And any house has a foundation. If there's a crack in the sides of the house, engineers go up under and reframe the foundation. They pump in stuff to level the foundation. They don't start with the top, they level the foundation. So some of these approaches that we're using today have been proven over decades that they do not work. So we have to abandon those ideologies. How we deal with that is we look at an implicit bias approach, so we can affect and teach people about their own biases, so they can work with explicit bias, so they can work with racism, and then collectively as a challenge, they can introduce legislation that can make the system fair and just. That's how we deal with our bias. That's the only way we can deal with our bias. Ira?
Thank you, Omar. I now have the opportunity to summarize what you have been presented this morning. And I do hope that that the information has resonated with you. First, we have defined implicit bias, and we discussed the different types of bias. In terms of the definition, we talked about it's unconscious. It's also fueled by information that you've received from early life experiences, as well as the social, cultural groups that you are a part of. Omar talked about the different types of bias, like me bias, confirmation bias, and anchoring bias, in the pros and cons of that. 2, we also talked about cultural groups, the importance of cultural groups, the groups that we're connected to, the groups who are affirming us, are telling us who we are. Those are our in-groups. But the challenge is, while we're in our in-groups, there are also out-groups who we may be biased against. As well, we talked about how the brain tries to organize and take shortcuts to categorize and organize the abundant amount of information that we receive. And the downside is that those mental schemas that we use to look at other folks can be very, very harmful. Third, we also talked about to look at certain behaviors that may suggest bias and differential treatment. Omar talked about how we could be placing so many Black kids in residential care and white kids to outpatient treatment. And we could possibly be harming both of them. We must look at these decisions and how we're doing this. And then finally, Omar talked about techniques. He talked about the implicit association test that is on Harvard University's website. I really, really encourage you to take the time. It's free. You'll get instant feedback of where your biases are. And there are a number of implicit association tests that you can take: gender, race, you name it, it's there. So it is really important that we do this. He also talked about making sure we expand our cultural groups, folks that we know. Just like Omar, I've had the opportunity to travel outside of this country. And it's outside of this country where your cultural view and understanding of people will get expanded. And in order to improve interactions, we need to have dialogue with different people. We need to understand how people different than ourselves make sense of the world. As he said, in his volunteering, he came to find out that he's just a short step from being homeless himself. So it's important that we really, as one of my professors used to say all the time, you've got to stretch yourself. You've got to challenge what you believe you know as the truth. Because the data is showing there's a problem that we must solve. And we must do as Adam said, we must use our sword and shield as a collective to make this world better for our children and their children to come. I'd like to leave you with a couple of questions, just 2 questions. And you may want to write them down. What specific steps will you take personally and or professionally to attack the racial disparities that is plaguing our nation? And within those disparities are real lives, are actual lives that we can make a difference in. And second, how should we use our collective sword and shield to forge a more just society where race, ethnicity, or the community that you live in will not predict the trajectory of a child's life? I want to thank you for the opportunity to share information with you on implicit bias. And I want to thank my co-presenter, Omar Bowler, who did a magnificent job. If the moderator can come up now and we'll take some questions.
Absolutely. And once again, thank you very much, Ira and Omar, for presenting today. That was a lot of useful and wonderful information. I certainly gained a lot from this conversation. And I would like to thank the audience for participating and for joining us here today. We did get several fantastic questions, and we're going to do our best to try to get through as many as we can. The first one is for you, Omar. Could you please go into a bit more of what confirmation bias means?
That's a good question. Confirmation bias well, actually, I want to say it's simple, but it's not, because it has control over us. We see something, it's a good example would be, and it's an unrelated example, but it's a good example. When your kids believe in Santa Claus, and despite no matter what you tell them, they're going to believe in Santa Claus. And when that older kid tells them that Santa Claus does not exist, they're going to run to mommy and say, hey, how come my brother is saying Santa Claus does not exist? So they're going to look for you to confirm that Santa Claus exists. And this is in other areas too. We're going to, again, our searches, we only search based on what confirms our true beliefs. We're only going to associate people who confirms our beliefs. So it's all about finding those connections. Again, there are those groups, but we're only seeking the groups that will confirm our natural beliefs.
Excellent. Thank you very much for the clarification. I hope that does help the folks listening in. The next question, this is for Ira. What implicit bias assessment would you recommend? Are there any ones that are better than others?
That's a good question. The Harvard Implicit Association test is a robust instrument that has been used on thousands of people. So that is the one I would definitely use. I would also suggest, please read other authors, read what other people think, and also you're going to find out when you take the AIT, because they're also conducting research of the responses. Their research is showing that overwhelmingly 75% of people who take the IAT have a negative bias toward people of color, which tells us we have a lot of work to do. That would be the one I would suggest would be the most robust.
Excellent. Thank you, Ira. The next question we have, it seems like it's something that both of you would be able to contribute a lot of great information. So we're going to go ahead and ask Omar to begin this. So the question goes, we are often on these calls and meetings and conversations with other like-minded individuals that are ready to do the work and ready to address their own implicit bias to take the steps to make changes. There are too many who are not involved in this conversation and are unwilling to do this kind of work that need it the most. How would we bring them in, and how often are the people, are these kinds of people of influence?
That is an excellent question. I love that question. I would say, as a part of a challenge, you have to collectively educate yourself and then approach it with a team of folks. You can't do it by yourself. So you approach it with a team of folks. So if there's one person that really has the leverage of a community, and it's hard to get them to get, for buy-in, at least even to get in the door with, you have to send something in writing. You have to send something to them acknowledging this is what I need to speak about. Because if you call them, it's easy to hang up and nobody to pay attention to you. So you really have to put it in writing so they know that this is an interest of yours. So because what we are is we happen to be reactive, and we don't want to be reactive. So when something happens, the truth of the matter is I can say I tried to address this, and nobody in this office was willing to do so, and I have the email to prove it. So I would say you do it as a collective. You may even send a note as a collective stakeholders that you want to address the situation. Hopefully that helps.
Can I add also, I would also try to, because dialogue is the key. Dialogue is the key. I would try to also have a one-on-one with that colleague in a very non-threatening way. As Omar talked about previously, many families having to have that conversation with their children. I learned early on as an African-American man that in order for people to just give me a few seconds, I had to be aware of how I spoke, how I looked, to not look threatening. And I definitely don't look threatening, but it's important that you create an environment where everyone feels that their voice is valued, that their opinions are valued. But as our illustrious supervisor tells us also, you have to look at the data. You also have to bring receipts to help people understand the reality that we're living in. And again, it should be done in the most non-threatening way, but you do have to get by that roadblock.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ira and Omar. Unfortunately, we are running a bit short on time, and we're going to have to end our question session there. Again, Ira and Omar, thank you very much for being here with us. And with that being said, as we end today's session, I'd like to share some information with all of our circuit team members. The Race to Impact course registration has already begun. If you haven't yet, please sign up at your earliest convenience to secure your preferred time and date. If you are unsure how to do so, please contact your Justice Reform Coordinator. This webinar transitions us into the Block 1 circuit level debriefs. Between now and July 22nd, circuit teams will meet to discuss the information shared during the first two webinars and their initial thoughts related to the ways their circuit should move forward towards a more equitable juvenile justice system. We hope you will continue to join us as we move forward to Block 2, beginning the system analysis. The next live webinar session will take place on July 22nd, discussing utilizing data with Karen Butterfield. Thank you all, and have a wonderful day.